A joint investigation by Canada's privacy czars has found OpenAI failed to respect privacy laws when it began training its artificial intelligence chatbot, ChatGPT. The findings follow a 2023 complaint that the company unlawfully collected, used, and disclosed personal information without consent. The CBC's Janice McGregor was following today's announcement. She joins us from Ottawa. So, Janice, what were some of the key takeaways?
Well, even though this complaint predates, if you will, some of the kind of more present-day concerns everyone's been raising about ChatGPT, it still has produced a series of findings and recommendations that feel very relevant in this moment. As you say, this was a joint investigation between the Federal Privacy Commissioner and the Privacy Commissioners from 3 provinces, Quebec, Alberta, and British Columbia. If you follow privacy law, you know that in some instances, the legislation that applies provincially can be even more stringent than the federal rules. So it was interesting to see today, to hear from the commissioners that while they all agreed that this complaint was well-founded, that there were areas of difference in terms of whether actions taken by the company since satisfied sort of some of the concerns according to the legislation. More on that in a minute. But to help people understand exactly what the issues were here, I'll give you some examples. First, they found that this technology was over-collecting private data, scraping, if you will, the internet, and as a result was gathering up things that were very private and should never have been sort of collected, used, and then sort of put to work generating other responses. You think about things like people's personal health conditions, their political views as gleaned from perhaps a discussion board, sensitive information about children. Then further, the report talks about how there was a lack of consent, a lack of transparency for this collection. That is a key component of privacy legislation in Canada, this idea that if an organization is going to take your private sensitive data, that you must know that this is happening and you must agree to it. And when you're scraping the internet, that simply does not happen. And as a result, things were being pulled off of social media, fed into these sort of OpenAI platforms, and used, again, without someone's knowledge. What results from that? Well, particularly troubling finding that there were results from these chatbots that weren't factual, that sometimes there were hallucinations, sort of data was taken and then sort of spit out that was inaccurate and then became kind of part of the ecosystem, if you will. And then finally, once this had happened, that private information was gleaned and perhaps information that wasn't factual was being generated, that there was no way for individuals to access, correct, insist on deletion of inaccurate information, that in fact people had no rights over sort of what sensitive information was out there and part of these models going forward. All of this unacceptable. The Federal Privacy Commissioner, Philippe Dufresne, describes in some detail how his investigation worked and also how these companies pushed ahead, launched this technology without making sure that they weren't violating people's rights in the process.
They were not initially done in a legally compliant way, and we're showing how they should have done that and how others should do that. And that means dealing with the reasonable expectations of Canadians, being very transparent, limiting the scope of what you're collecting and having these types of approach, using innovation to protect privacy, having retention mechanism, making it user-friendly for Canadians to know what information is there. If they don't want to be there, how can you opt out? So this shows in a way the powerful impact that an investigation like this one can have. But ideally, we wouldn't have to do this if privacy by design was applied.
The Alberta Privacy Commissioner noted that in her judgment, this is a quasi-constitutional right, the right to privacy, but also that the horse is out of the barn here. These models have already taken this information. So what do you do? The assessments across the 4 commissioners at the news conference differed in terms of whether companies had done enough. The federal conclusion was that yes, conditionally, the complaint was resolved, but the 2 from Alberta and BC said no. The complaint hadn't been resolved. Quebec landed somewhere in the middle, and the interesting thing about that is Quebec is the jurisdiction that can actually levy fines for non-compliance. In this case, though, Quebec just issued recommendations.
So, Janice, this technology has breached privacy laws. So what can be done to change that?
And exactly. And this is what people are grappling about. There isn't a lot of teeth behind the privacy watchdog kind of structure that we have here. Not a lot these commissioners can do, but they all agreed that laws and regulations around privacy protections need updating. Some cases, they're decades old. They never imagined this kind of artificial intelligence and internet scraping that's been going on. Sharon Bauer is a privacy lawyer, and she was talking about particularly around sort of the consent of people to have their data used. There's a real need to do better here.
Our legislation is grounded on needing to seek consent before collecting, using, and disclosing personal information. Unfortunately, and as the regulators rightfully said, that model doesn't quite sit well with AI technology. So for example, OpenAI was scraping personal information on the entire web as well as collecting it from third parties. In that regard, they would need to seek consent from individuals. As you can imagine, that is nearly impossible to do. And so consent doesn't work. So we need to think about what other lawful basis could we have in our legislation for those kind of technologies to properly collect information without necessarily seeking consent, but still providing enough transparency to the public.
Several people have pointed out today that if a company wants the trust of people who use their technology, they have to fix things like this. And the commissioners have said in the case of OpenAI, it has already made some changes. I think that what's interesting will be to see if legislators, if federal ministers believe enough has been done, or if they think that significant additional safeguards need to be written into the law. The question is how? How, as legislators, do they stay ahead of a technology like this?
Janice, thank you. The CBC's Janice McGregor live in Ottawa.